So yeah, here we are in our product, picking up where we left off. So we have the geometry of the bottle in place, and we have the first step of applying our label. If we remember where we left off, we have that checker material, which is what we use to sort of line up and approximate the size of our UV map, and then we have the start of the label. And if we open up this material, we can see we have the label, but we also have white over it. And the reason for that is because we have to save out an extra little bit of information from Photoshop that we can use here in the alpha channel in Cinema. So let's go and do that. So jumping over to my Photoshop document, this is where I left off. And if we close some of this, okay. So we have our label, and what we want to do is we want to save a version of this mask right here. If we're familiar with Photoshop, we remember that black portions of the mask are going to hide that layer, and white portions are going to reveal that layer. And so we basically want to replicate that just real quick here in Photoshop. So the easiest way that I know how to do that in 2 quick steps is to enable the background first off, and then all we have to do is simply turn this white layer white, basically fill it with white. So you can do that by painting in or whatever, making a selection, but there is actually a pretty easy overlay down here on the little FX button. I know it'll be hard to see, but in the recording, we just want to click this FX layer to add a layer style, and we're looking for color overlay. And color overlay will basically fill this whole layer with whatever color we specify. In this case, we want to give it 100% white. Okay, so that's basically kind of an egg shape, white and black, and this is exactly what we want to save out. So we're going to save this as an image, and I'll just do, you can do like a PNG or whatever, so this will work. So I'm going to call this bottle texture alpha. So even though it's not technically an alpha channel, we're going to use it in place of an alpha channel. So just to be clear with myself, I like to name things accordingly. So we'll load up our alpha channel, and we'll load in this image here. So we'll have a version of the label. This is applied to the color channel, and then a version of the alpha, which is going to be plugged into the alpha channel. And we can see here, as the sides of this label are now all the way see-through, so that's cool. Basically means that we can turn this checker material into a glass material, and we're basically there as far as the label goes. So let's get into that. So we're going to rename this glass because this will be turned into glass. You can go ahead and make a new material or whatever, but I'm just going to use this existing one. And to make something glass, I think we've touched on it a little bit possibly in some assignments. We are going to use the transparency channel here. So if we enable the transparency, we will see that this will basically become all the way see-through. And the reason for that is one setting here called refraction, which we need to change. So if I can find a good reference image, glass refraction. This isn't so bad. So I believe most of us have seen some sort of demonstration of what refraction is, maybe not knowing it by name, but knowing it visually, is that as light, or in this case, our sort of imaginary 3D eyes as pixels, as we go through an object that is made of glass, the light sort of bends a little bit. It gets redirected depending on the composition of the glass, how thick it is, etc. But just overall, this phenomena or the term or whatever is called refraction. And like most things in 3D, there is a lot of math behind it. Thankfully, we don't necessarily have to know much about that math to get by. We just kind of need to know just what we need to know, and we can sort of move past that. And that easy hit of information, I guess, that's important in this case is glass index of refraction. So if we jump back to cinema, this refraction value at 1 is currently not bending or not distorting the light whatsoever. It's basically treating the glass as if it doesn't have any refractive property. So the proper value that we're looking for is relatively easy to Google. So I just typed in index of refraction and then glass. So you could look up like plastic, milk, water, some sort of other liquid if you're doing a specific liquid that's different than me, and basically kind of find your way through that. The short answer is that glass is somewhere in the 1.5 range. So if we type in 1.5, we'll see this little preview is going to look a little bit more glass-like. And at this point is a good idea to start just real simply, starting to bring in a little bit of either background information or lighting, so that way as we are making changes here, we can actually see what's going on. Because I could change this refraction value all day long, and if I click render, because I don't really have anything in this scene currently, it's going to be pretty hard for me to figure out what it's doing. So I want to bring in some sort of sky or something for it to reflect or refract, basically in an environment. And we can do that through the content browser. So if we're here at the computers at school, unfortunately I don't know if we can do this if you have the student version, but in the content browser we can click the little search box, the little magnifying glass thing, and if we search the term HDRI, we will find examples of images. If I make this a little bit bigger, examples of images that we can use to basically put our environment in. And some of these might be better than others. It changes each version. So this is the first time I'm working with this batch of images. Here we go. This was the one that I was looking for. So if you find one that you like, you can double click it, and it should make a new material for you. If it doesn't, let me know, and I can show you how to save it differently. The alternative for this, if you are on Google or at home, is to search the term HDRI on Google. And this is basically what an HDR is. It is a version of an image that has been shot on a camera in a specific way that it covers all of the environment around in 360 degrees. It's kind of like if you've taken a panorama photo on your phone where you like do it like step by step, but then you also do the above and below you as well. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but a panorama on your phone is a pretty good way to describe what that is. So the image that I've found is kind of this interior sort of wooden lobby of something. It almost kind of looks, it looks sort of brewery-ish. You know, it's got a lot of like metal beams and wood and some light, some bright sunlight. So I am going to apply it to a sky object. So I've got my sky, and I can apply this material to my sky, and we'll see it's super low res, but if I pan around we can kind of get an idea of what's going on, and I can make this slightly less crappy looking by opening the material and going to the editor tab and then changing this texture preview from default to something slightly larger, and now I've got a little bit clearer idea of what I'm looking at. So we can sort of look around here and see that there's some cool stuff in here, and I can make a little floor. So just for fun right now, I'm going to make a little box that's going to serve as a little platform for my bottle to sit on, just so that I can start to maybe see shadows, whatever. So let's now try to click render and see what we get. Right, so doesn't look like glass, and that's because we changed this refraction value back to 1. So let's bump it to 1.5, and we'll see that now it's starting to actually interact with its environment. And if we dial this up and down, we'll start to get different looks for the glass, maybe even a little bit lower. So we're starting to get somewhere, and this will work out pretty nicely, I think. Cool. So there's not a whole lot of shadow going, so let's check out potentially why that is. Shadows on. Interesting. Okay, so maybe let's see if this material doesn't cast shadows. No. Okay, let's just try a light. So we'll try an area light, move it up over here. Okay. Still no, oh, that's right. Yes, we're gonna have to enable shadows on the light. So we'll do area shadow. There we go. That's starting to do a little something. So this environment that I've sort of added in is giving us a lot of sort of bright highlights. It's really making this glass bright. So I'm going to try to maybe tone down the luminance, possibly. So I'm going to pull the brightness down to 0, and then I'm going to pull this mix strength down a bit, and hopefully dim this room a little bit, just so that the glass isn't quite so blown out. It's a little bit better, but this can be sort of tricky to work with. Working with glass is a fun thing to learn for the first time. Replicating good-looking glass is one of the tougher things to replicate, but I don't say that to scare us. I say it sort of as a challenge. It is a necessary challenge that we should overcome if we would like to continue in 3D. So another thing that we can do is add some color to this glass. As some of you might be familiar, if not, we can just jump to our reference photos and identify the fact that most beer bottles are tinted. Now there is a reason for them being tinted. It's not just necessarily the liquid contents being darker that is making these look dark. It is in fact the glass itself. It being darker helps prevent light coming into the liquid, which accelerates the speed at which beer goes bad. So that's just kind of a fun little fact. So we want to replicate that. Again, kind of the goal of this assignment is to replicate some sort of aspect of a photo, and if the glass is tinted in my reference photo, then I should probably think about tinting the glass in my render. So if we jump into our glass, in our transparency, we have a handful of ways of actually coloring it. What we can do is we can add a color in up here, and additionally we can add in a color here in the absorption color. This is a little bit more advanced of an explanation, so I'm going to start with just the color first. So I'm going to get kind of a darkish, and we'll see what effect this has. Now, I would like to point out, we're getting back into the territory of what you see in the viewport is not necessarily what you get in the render. I really want to stress that, as artists, as we're learning, that the viewport here can only show so much, and this material preview here can only show so much. This color, I think most of us would agree, is somewhere in the middle range, kind of in terms of darkness. It's actually at 50% value exactly. And when we render this, this doesn't look like a 50% kind of color value, by no means. This actually looks a lot darker than you would expect. So I'm going to brighten this up a bit more. And we're starting to get something in here on the neck of the bottle that's starting to look a little bit more appropriate. But I do want to point out this kind of white, mushy sort of reflection or whatever. And this is going to be because of our specular. The specular is sort of a old-timey kind of fake reflection. It has its use cases, certainly. But in this case, I think we're either going to dial it down significantly or even maybe remove it entirely. So let's just try removing it, and we'll see that that white mushy reflection is no longer present. And that is sort of aiming back at where that light used to be, sort of to the left of screen. It's kind of like a faux highlight. So we can try to add in our own reflection, and like usual, I'm probably going to pick a GGX. And this is going to be way, way too strong by default, because now it's going to look like chrome. So that's not what we want either. So this reflection, I'm going to pull this down a lot, probably to under 10%. And I'm going to give it a little bit of roughness, just because most of these bottles aren't perfectly clear. If we were to examine one in front of us and sort of hold it up in front of a light, you would see that it's not perfectly see-through. So it can be a little bit tough to see, so I'm going to zoom in. When we add roughness, we're also sort of adding a little bit of grain to this render, sort of inadvertently. And the reason for that is because the sampling here, sampling in rendering terms is kind of is going to be a new concept for us. Think of the way that I like to explain it is, think of doing a math problem, and you come up like a really complex math problem, and you come up with an answer, right? You've got one answer, and if you do that math problem again, you might come up with a different answer. Maybe you did stuff in a different order of operations, or maybe you missed a step or whatever, but you came out with a different answer. And basically, that is what this noise is. Each one of these pixels has a different sort of answer to what this like reflection question is. Basically, we're asking the program, hey, I told you to be reflective, but one pixel and its neighboring pixel, they kind of got like different answers on like what color they should sort of be. So we want to add more samples. It's basically running this math equation more times so that maybe it'll average out to a better answer. So this sampling subdivisions value of 4 is kind of the default. We can try 5 or 6, not 56. It doesn't work necessarily in a linear scale. It's not like 4 is just a hair bit different than 5 or 6. And it might even be hard to see because of the other render settings we have might be overriding what we're trying to go over. So I'm going to leave it at 6 for now, and we'll get back to it in a little bit later. But just sort of realize that this render is not going to be perfect kind of right out of the box. There is quite a bit of work we have to implement realism. So this reflection's not looking too shabby. It's getting there. Some of the siding on this bottle is looking pretty nice, but we're obviously still pretty dark here in this shadow. Now one thing I could do is I could add another light, sort of off to the other side. So this will be my left light. So this light is kind of over here. I could hold Control and drag a copy, bring this copy over here sort of to the other kind of corner. Rename this right light. Sort of get in a little bit and hit render. And we're going to see that we're illuminating sort of both sides of the bottle. We're able to read the entire label, which is good. It would be probably, I would say, probably discouraged by a client if this was a real job to sort of show off one of their products and not have the label be like very visible. Hopefully that kind of goes without saying. If you are trying to give off information, in this case, you know, if we're sort of making a mock advertisement, the product, the label, the name of the product, that is the key information that we want to sort of get across. So we want to make sure the whole label is visible, or as visible as possible, and part of that includes not making making sure that a big shadow isn't cast kind of over the front of our label. So one thing that we can do to give us this a little bit more interesting sort of I guess properties as a photograph is jumping back to our render here. This one is pretty good because as a reference we see two very strong lights on each side of the bottle. They're casting this very nice bright highlight sort of along the whole scale of the bottle on the far left and far right sides. It sort of is drawing the eye inwards into the label as a photographic technique that is pretty popular. We can see that sort of contrasted here in this render or photograph, in that we only have one light sort of off to the side, left of frame here. We can double check that because we see shadowing over here on the right of frame. So these are, again, things that I want to point out. In our photograph reference, we can gain a lot of information without necessarily even really realizing. If we just pay attention to where lights and shadows are, we can get pretty far. So I sort of like this approach of having really powerful lights on the sides, almost even behind the object. So I'm going to try to set up this and demonstrate how we can do that. So if we sort of look down on our scene, we can bring these lights over, aim them a bit. So if we see we have these lights on each side of our object, and here I am going to start, just for the time being, I'm going to start rendering here with the picture viewer, just so that we can sort of compare and contrast our renders. Again, that is this middle render button. You don't really have to do this if you're just kind of following along, or if you're just watching along. But if you're following along and actually working through this, I would suggest getting used to doing this yourself. So the cool thing about the picture viewer is, well, it's a little bit slower, but the cool thing is that we can actually go back and look at our older renders and compare sort of what progress we're making, what changes we're making. So I want to point out how bright and how tall this light is in this render. It's going along the entire neck and body of the bottle, but if we compare ours, we see really only a bright highlight kind of in the middle of this neck, or sort of on this curve, and then on the neck of the bottle in the mouth, we only see a little bit sort of up top here. We're not getting any light over here in the bottom left. And the reason for that, if I just make a camera real quick, the reason we're only getting light in the upper sort of portions of this is because, well, our lights are relatively small. And this is a simple fix. All we have to do to get more light into our scene is to scale up our lights. So I'm going to use the little scale handles to scale them up a bit, and we can see that they're significantly taller now than what they used to be. So if we jump into this render, oops, so I want to render using the picture viewer now. we're starting to get these taller, more column-like lighting effects, which is kind of cool. In the case of my reference, this is the vibe that I want to go for. If you have a different lighting reference, one thing that will be common to run into is what is called a 3-point light setup. So if you've been through the photography classes, you'll be familiar with that, hopefully. But if not, point light setup. We'll see a 3-point light is a relatively it's relatively similar to what we just had a moment ago where our two lights were in front of the camera, but there's also a light that will be behind. And that'll help sort of cast light on the edge of the object. So this is probably more common than a 2-point light for certain types of photography. And I would encourage you, if you don't have much experience with photography light setups, is examine some of these things on Google and just sort of start to familiarize yourself. We're going to learn a bit more here in this lecture on how the size of lights and the brightness of lights also matter, but the positioning is really, really important, and you can only get used to that by doing it yourself and learning through sort of repetition and practice. So we're making a little bit of progress in terms of how bright the lights are on the side, but if I zoom in, we can see on the neck of the bottle we're getting a little bit of darkness. And this is because on these very, very extreme angles of the bottle, we're actually seeing what is behind the object, or not necessarily what's like completely behind the object, but what is at a much more extreme angle. So if we're looking at this from above, remember, so this is our line of sight. On the far side of the bottle, you know, the extreme sort of left or rightmost sides, we would actually be seeing a light if it was like back here behind the object. So what I want to do is I scaled my lights vertically, but I don't want to forget or neglect their horizontal scale. So if I enlarge these now, and we jump into our camera, and I render once more to the picture viewer, we'll start to see that as I widened my lights, as I made them larger horizontally, we're going to see that this light is going to get closer and closer to the edge of the bottle. So remember, this is where we were a moment ago with our thin lights, and this is, oops, wrong way. So this is where we were with our thin lights, and this is where we're getting our light is appearing to be much closer to the edge of the bottle. In my case, that's what I'm looking for. Your case might be a little bit different. So I think I'm pretty close. It's just I need to get a little bit more light on the front of the bottle. This label is a little dark. This is a bit brighter and sort of happier looking. So I'm going to add one more light to the front of my scene. And I'm going to put it, at least for now, behind my camera, just so that it's not too bright. And this will be my front light. And if we run a render with this, we'll see as we compare and contrast between these two, we're starting to get a good amount of illumination hitting our logo. Our logo is nice and visible. It's starting to look a little bit more appealing and clear. So that is a little bit more, I think, in the direction that I want to go. A little bit more appropriate for our target. I think the next thing we want to get into, we've developed our lighting a little bit, and I think I mentioned in the last video, when we're working with this assignment, it's going to be a good idea to sort of work step by step. We're going to work on a little bit of modeling and then do a little bit of lighting, a little bit of texturing, go back, do a little bit more modeling, and then do a little bit more lighting, sort of kind of inching our way to the finish line instead of just doing stuff in one big chunk, like when we did the first assignment. We would model a bunch of stuff, and then we would texture a bunch of stuff, and then we did the lighting at the very end, and then we rendered it. We're going to go about this process a little bit different here. So I'm going to model a little bit, and I think it's a good time to actually go about making the contents of my bottle. Obviously, this being a beverage, it will have a liquid inside, and that's kind of the whole point. That's what you're buying. You're not buying the bottle, you're buying what's in the bottle. So let's go and make that. So for the time being, I'm going to group some of my lights and cameras and my sky. And this is the platform. And this will be scenery. So I'm going to turn off this scenery null, so that way we're just getting back to the basics. Bottle only, no fuss. So we've got our bottle. For the time being, the way that I'm going to make the liquid is by starting with a copy of the object, or of the bottle itself. We're basically going to chop off most of the bottle and then turn that into the liquid. So we're going to make our copy and name it liquid, and we're going to turn off bottle, so that way we're looking at just the liquid, and for the time being it's not going to look a whole lot different. Obviously it has all the same materials and stuff, so real quick we're going to alleviate that, and we're going to make a liquid material and make this a little bit different colored and a little bit brighter. Obviously with a beverage like this, the color can be any number of colors. It could be hot pink if it was a crazy wild soda or whatever. But in this case, a sort of a golden color is going to be what I'm going to go for. A porter would be kind of a darker drink, but I'm just going to ignore that for the time being. And we'll apply this liquid. So this is the material. I'm going to delete the rest of these so I can kind of just focus on this. And then we will start selecting these portions of the bottle. So the easiest way to make the content, or the liquid contents of the bottle, is to start on the inside of the bottle. So I'm going to navigate my camera on into the inside. So we are in the bottle, and I want to start with this bottom ring. Now you could select those, but I'm going to use the loop selection to select the bottle kind of from the inside out. Now I can just shift click each of these, but it would be pretty tedious and even maybe a little bit challenging, depending on what your glass looks like, to go about and shift click all of these. We can even see I'm sort of messing up the positioning of the mouse already. So I'm going to do a different command. And the command that I'm going to do is to basically expand my selection out one ring each time. And that is under U. And then the command is grow selection. All the way down at the bottom here, it's Y. So we'll see when I hit UY, each time it goes outwards a ring. So this will be a little annoying, but it'll be a bit quicker if you are fast on the keyboard. And I'm going to go up about how high a capped bottle would be filled. So that'll be some way up the neck. And the cool thing about this is I don't even have to really even be able to see what I'm selecting. It just kind of works. So that would be about good. It would probably be a tad higher, but I'm just going to stop there because that's where my geometry stops. Much like when we were UV mapping in the last assignment, we're going to want to invert this selection. So the reason we're doing this is we're going to basically turn this shell that we've currently selected into the liquid. But we don't want to delete this part, we want to delete the rest of the bottle. So if I invert this, U, and then I to invert, if I delete these polygons, we're going to see that I'm left with basically what was the inside of the bottle. Would you look at that? Pretty straightforward. So I just have to cap off this top here, and that's not going to be too hard of a feat. If I just use my loop selection and my extrude tool, I can come in a little bit, just a hair. And then from here, I just want to close this hole that we have left, and that is under the modeling menu. And then we're looking for close polygon hole up towards the top of the list, D. And we'll see that this is sort of lighting up exactly what we want. So I have my flat sort of liquid contents, and then I'll have my bottle. Now, as I sort of look through this, we can see the sort of faint orange highlight of where the liquid contents are, which is pretty awesome. We can sort of start to visualize where our liquid actually is, which is sweet. But there's one last step, and if I turn on my scenery, we will hopefully be able to demonstrate why that is. So I'm going to render back to here, and we see that it's going to take a little bit longer, and that is because kind of like how I described earlier with the reflections, how the computer is kind of doing a little bit of math to figure out what the heck's going on. If we have more contents inside the glass, we have now given the computer a little bit more math to kind of worry about. So it's going to go a little bit slower. But if we look really closely, we can see a little bit of a line there, and it's probably because my liquid is too dark. So if I brighten this quite a bit, we will see if we get a visible portion of this. If we don't, I have another idea of what that last step of modeling is. And I believe it's because we need to scale our liquid ever so slightly. When we are working with things in 3D, we've kind of gone over it with the floor and stuff, where sometimes if you have two layers of geometry, if they're in the exact same spot, they will sort of fight, and it's kind of hard for the computer to know which one's in front. I believe we could be running into that case. So the solution, if you're modeling a liquid sort of the way that I have, is to shrink the liquid by like 0.01%. So if we just grab our scale tool, hopefully I'm not crazy. So it's going to be really hard to see, but just above the mouse cursor, or not the mouse cursor, the little axis, it says 99.9%. So if we scale it just a touch, hopefully we will start to see something. It's also possible that the thickness of, or the darkness of the glass material is partly at fault. But yeah, I believe we're starting to get somewhere. So again, I know it's a little hard to tell, so hopefully on the projector this is kind of coming through. There's a little bit of a nice warm amber color right here, whereas before we made our liquid, see there's kind of nothing right there, and here there's kind of a little something there. So I know my liquid is showing up properly. It's just a matter of kind of dialing in kind of the color and the material settings of it. But I think I'm happy with this for now. As far as getting the liquid set up, I've got a material made for it, so I can always edit that a little bit later as I want. But I think it's a good time to move on to the cap now, kind of finish off this bottle. So if we turn our scenery off, and I'm going to make the liquid a child of the bottle, just so that I know they'll always move around together. Let's get started on the cap. So we can make the cap by starting with a disk, and if we raise this up, kind of position it up here, I can turn my display to line mode so that we can start to see. The segments on this are going to be pretty important because I could model a fancy top like this, but the more traditional sort of bottle cap style, man, that is super high resolution. If we just jump to Google and look up bottle cap, I want to get something that sort of approximates these little ridges, because this is a super common aspect of bottle caps, and you know, I'm trying to go for something that looks realistic-ish, so I want to try to model this stuff as realistic as I can. So I could save off one of those, but the starting point, I think, is going to be good enough. And one thing I do want to do is give myself some more segments in the rotation value to work with, but less in the horizontal section. So I think I'm happy with that as a starting point, and I can make it editable. And then I want to add in one sort of division that will represent the sort of flat portion of the cap. So I'm going to use my knife tool, K and then L, and I'm going to insert a cut that is sort of along the depth of where the cap will be. That's pretty good. So then I'm going to use my loop select to select the rim, kind of pull that down, and we're starting to get somewhere. So if I move this down sort of to set it on top, we're pretty close. Obviously we want to add a bevel there, but the magic here is these sort of ridges, and an easy way, or I think a creative way to go about generating those ridges is to scale every other point. So this will be a little tedious. There is actually not an excellent way to select every other point. So that's every other point. And if I scale these, again, I want to scale them uniformly. So I'm going to use this corner handle here. And that isn't going to be too shabby. If I put this into a subdivision surface, which is this object right here, and we start to round it, we're starting to get these visible ridges, which is cool. But I do need to bevel this rim. So this was the rim that we wanted to be solid. We want to bevel this a bit. And once we have our subdivision surface made, we can hit Q on our keyboard to kind of turn it on and off. And if I turn off my line mode, we can start to see, you know, we're getting there. We have to give this a little bit more accentuation by scaling these a little bit more. So that's not too bad. Now, one thing that is off is sort of the overall sort of scale of how far these stick out. So I'm going to select this whole rim on the bottom here and scale the whole thing inwards. So that's a little bit more appropriate, I think. And the middle here, oopsie daisy, the middle here would have just a hint of rounding. So I'm going to pull this point up ever so slightly. So this way, it now has a little bit of a bump to it. So I'm pretty happy with that. For the time being, I think that's pretty good there. So I'm just going to make a metal material, and we're going to call this cap metal. We're going to do the old reflectance thing. So we want to uncheck color, go into reflectance, add a GGX layer, which will make it reflective. It's obviously too reflective currently. So we're going to raise our roughness up a bit and pull down the reflection strength so it's not perfectly bright chrome-like. And I'm going to tint this a bit of a golden color. Kind of start to match the vibe of some of the gold that is in this logo here. Oopsie daisy. We're going to want to turn our scenery back on, jump into our camera, and we'll fire off a render. So we've got our cap starting to look like a cap. We've got some liquid. It needs a little bit more work, but I think I'm going to kind of tinker with that a little bit more off screen and then catch us back up with where we land. Because it is a very, very sort of tedious process, nailing kind of the look of something, I think our time would be used a little bit better by moving on to the label as we sort of wrap up a little bit. We're kind of at 45 minutes now, so we're going to jump into the label, I think. So that will take us back to Photoshop, and I want to turn off my color overlay. So what I want to do for the first portion of this is I want to isolate kind of these different color groups, kind of the tan, the red, and then the darker gold. I'll probably lump the black into the darker gold, but we're just going to see how well we can do with the magic select or magic wand. So we're going to try to select this red, and I want contiguous to be off, and Photoshop changed its layout. Okay, so we can see that the red was only selected in the portion of the red that I clicked. I want to turn off this button. Try to select that red again. So this has selected more of that red, which is going to make me happy. So obviously I can use my refine edge tool and try to clean this up a little bit, but just for the sort of sake of speed here in the lecture, I am going to just sort of forego that step. But it's one of those things of like the more effort you put in, the better end result you get. So I would recommend trying to do it. But I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to fill this layer with right now a 50% gray. So on this new layer, I'm going to, with my selection on the new layer, I can hit Alt and then delete, and this will be red label. So then I can get rid of my selection with Control D and then turn that label off. And we're going to see what I'm up to in a moment here. I'm going to now work on the gold, and I have to make sure that my label is the right layer that is selected. And we're going to try to work in a little bit more of this. Again, I'm going to try to do the gold and the black together. This is a little bit hard to kind of see what I'm working with, so I'm just going to take a stab at edit. And on this layer, I'm going to fill it with a 25% gray. And then lastly, we will go with the cream color. So hopefully that's going to give us something. This one we're going to fill with a 75% white. Okay, so if I turn these back on, we are going to get something that's kind of in this ballpark with these different gray tones. And if you can imagine going back to the first assignment when we were working with the carpet and we found ourselves a bump map or a normal map, we are going to work with this to give our label a little bit of kind of like etching or a little bit of kind of texture. Obviously these speckles of random colors are one of the things that I would want to try to clean out, but well, we'll get there when we get there. So what I want to try to do is save this. So we're going to try to save this as a bottle. We're going to call it, oops, PNG, please. So we're going to call this bottle bump texture. Cool. And if we jump into our material, our label material, we're going to load this into the bump channel and just see kind of what effect we get. So bottle bump. So it's not going to look like a whole lot until we render. And it's pretty subtle, so we might have to bump up even the strength of it. Most likely that is the case. So this strength of 20% is super low. I'm going to times it by 5. And here we go. So we're starting to get a little something in the pure sort of reflection here. This is before we added the bump map, and this is after we add the bump map. We're starting to get a little bit of kind of information here on the front of this label. And another thing I can do is add this into the reflection, or the specular. So here in our specular setting, we can add this layer into the specular channel. So I don't have a good visual representation, so let's try to search on Google. Nope. Okay. See if I can find something that will give, there we go. Okay, so to demonstrate, I searched up the first thing that came to mind, and that is fancy business cards. So here on this fancy business card, we can see portions of it are more reflective than others. It's kind of like the difference between matte and gloss paint. So we can use that same bump map that we just made and make different portions of our label more or less reflective. So if we add in the GGX and pull that down a bit, and here in the layer color, this is going to be where we want to load in our texture. So I'm going to load in that bottle bump. And now, hopefully, we're going to start to get somewhere. Yeah. So it's a little bit overdone, but we can start to see that different colors of this image are reflecting at different amounts, which is kind of cool. This would be very prominent in something like a gold, if something was like a gold flake kind of label or something like that. This is super common on kind of upscale or kind of higher end products. fancy packaging like this, so why not try to replicate that, I say. But I think that's a pretty good spot to end this segment. We've done a little bit more advanced kind of material work. The next thing we'll be getting into more sort of advanced rendering and stuff, and kind of wrapping up some more of the scenery, kind of focusing on our camera a little bit, but that'll be in the next assignment, or sorry, the next lecture. We're coming up on an hour, so I think it's a good place to cut it. One last thing, I guess we'll give it one last render for the road, and we'll start to see. This is before we started working on our reflection, and this is after. It's a little subtle, but this red is maybe a little bit more glossy than some of the other colors, which I think it's a cool little detail. Little details get noticed by clients, so cool. That'll conclude this portion.